Good afternoon and welcome to the 35th CALLERLAB Convention. Today is the 18th of March, 2008. I am Tim Crawford and your panelists today are, well, all of you. So this is a War Stories section, and the intention of this is to just have a kind of a light discussion with respect to kind of the things that have happened through your careers in calling. So just by a show of hands, and not just calling but dancing as well, how many people have been calling more than 5 years? How about more than 10 years? And dancing? More than 20 years? Holy smokes, there should be lots of stories then. That's good. So, more than 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. There must not have been any square dancing 50 years ago. All right. Mike Oliveri has agreed to be the mic. So Mike will run the mic. And then when you think of a story, if you could just raise your hand, let me know, and I'll put you on the list, and then I'll call you out by name, and you'd like to do it. Use the mic if you have a question.
Bob Pointer, Florida. What kind of stories are you wanting?
I'm glad you've asked that question. I'm glad you brought that up. Because
I have some if they're not too bad.
I would like to set the ground rules. So this whole session is designed to be entertaining for people who get the tapes afterwards. That's right. And the session is called War Stories, so when we leave, we'll all be vets. So I'm going to start off with a couple of stories. Maybe we'll trigger some stories, and you can tell them. But the one thing that I do want to make sure is that if it is an embarrassing story to somebody other than yourself, I would ask that you not use names unless you know that the person is all right with it. And then you have to be sure of it. We don't really want to embarrass anybody. We don't want to offend anybody. Things that have to do with age, sex, marital status, religion, we want all that stuff out of there. I want it to be very fun, very, the funny things that have happened. They could have to do with your calling, something that happened to you dancing, something that happened while you were traveling to a dance, something that happened while you were preparing for a dance, anything like that at all. So we do not want to offend people. So I'm going to try to keep a list. Actually, you know what? Oh yeah, Roy's gone. He's out of here. I'll try to keep a list of the people who, if I know your name, I'll write your name down. Otherwise, I'll do it by color of hair. Well, no, that's not going to work either. I'll do it by some other method. So Mike will be our Mike. So I'll start off with just one story, then maybe you can get along this. If you have a question, you have to use the microphone. And I have forms to fill out in triplicate if you have questions. So this story for me is a story that happened during a dance. This was about 15 years ago when I was calling. All kinds of things have happened to me, but I tried to find the one that I thought was the most unique. And I was calling in this little community hall for a one-night stand for a group of hikers. And they just wanted me to come up and do a little square dancing for the evening. So I went up to this hall that wasn't much larger than this, 20 by 30. It was an old wooden hall, beautiful wooden floor, like the types you would see in churches, just beautiful hardwood strip floor. The building was older building, but it was high ceiling and it had the beam that ran down the middle of the roof, and it was next to a river. And from the parking lot, you walk down to this building. It was next to the river, and it was a 100-year-old building. And I teach them a bunch of dancing, and they're hikers, so they're kind of rambunctious. And I taught them how to kick on a right and left grand, and they would jump up and down, and there was probably 8 or 10 squares, and we're dancing along like crazy. Everybody's having a grand old time, and all of a sudden, the main beam on the floor cracked, and the floor dropped about 3 feet and put a hole between the stage and about halfway down the hall, and about 2/3 of the squares slid down the floor and into the basement. And it was the main beam on the floor, which is a big, 8 by 8 pillar, an old tree that they'd made. Apparently the hall floods all the time in the springtime because it was next to the river. And so over time it got rotten, and then all the dancing and the floor cracked. These people slid into the basement. The walls came in a little bit. None of the doors would close. None of the windows would close. The building was actually condemned right after that. So we really did that day. We brought the house down. So that's about my funniest story. So, and then another story that happened at a dance. I'll just tell you this one too. It was at a beginner class, and there was a group right in front of me. There's about 4 or 5 squares. This happened years ago, and a lady right in front of me was dancing. She had big hair. Back then, it was big hair. She had big hair, and there was the guys came all dressed up, and a fella had a really nice shirt on with cufflinks, and she did a dive through, and her hair got caught in the guy's cufflink, and it took her hair off. Turned out she was wearing a wig, and that the guy really didn't know that it was hanging on his arm, and as he went around, he dropped it, and it hit the floor. People weren't really aware of it. The next square, somebody was laughing and having a good time, and he kicked the wig, and the wig went screaming across the floor right towards the lady who was sitting on the side, saw it coming, thought it was an animal, and screamed and almost had a heart attack. And the poor lady who lost her hair, she was mortified, but we lived through those types of things. So those are the types of stories we want to hear from. We want to make it fun and short. And I don't want to 5 minutes max. We don't need a big dissertation of this stuff. So, and there's one other ground rule: if somebody's asked me specifically to say that if the story involves Jerry Justin, it is forbidden to repeat. All right. So Mike has the mic.
You going to make a list, or how do you want to do this?
Yeah, I'm going to make a list. I'll try to make a
list.
Raise your hand if you have the story, and we'll try to get you. Okay. Ernie Kinney.
Ernie Kinney, Fresno, California. This happened back in the late 70s or early 80s. I was calling in Rehoboth, Massachusetts, Johnson's Barn, full house Saturday night. And we finished, and they asked me if I'd come back the following year, and I said, well, I can give you a Thursday night, but I can't give you a Saturday night. So I take my youngest son with me the next year, and we go back, and on a Thursday night, we're sitting around. The dance starts at 8:30. We're sitting there at 8:15. No one's there. About 8:27, here comes 4 or 5 cars driving in, and I didn't think anything about it. They just ran in and squared up. They didn't pay, they didn't anything, just came in and squared up. So I jumped up on the stage and started calling. Every time they'd promenade by me, they'd look up, why don't you call something, you stupid idiot? And I'm, it's cool, chilly, but sweat's pouring down now. And the second tip, I thought, well, I'll get to them. I did a hot singing call, same thing. Every time they'd promenade by, 4 squares, all they were. Third tip, I thought, well, I'll do something. So I hit them with some pretty difficult little basics, and it broke them down. Here they come running up the stage, laughing. I said, Ernie, when you were here last year, we found out you're coming back. We bought this dance out, and we've been working all year to get even with you. So I said, you made it.
Virgil Forbes, Maryland. I was in the Navy, and luckily the Navy moved me all around, which was a blessing. The only square dance tour I ever made started in San Francisco, and my transportation was the USS Enterprise, an aircraft carrier. And we did Hawaii, where Buddy Weaver graciously let me call it Kapiolani Park, and we did Subic Bay, the Mabuhay Squares, that means hello. Singapore, where we did the Anytime Squares. Anytime they could get 8 dancers together, they had a square dance. And finally, about 4 months later, we pull into Perth, Australia. Now, I don't know how much geography you know. Perth is kind of like where Los Angeles would be in this country. But the next big city is like where New Orleans would be in the States. So, I moved into a hotel ashore, had a rental car, got out my national, international directory. We don't have those anymore, but it was real good for traveling, man. Looked up and Monday night and called the phone. Guy answers the phone. Oh, yeah, we're glad to have you. We've got a ceremony tonight, and we needed an extra fella. So I drove up there, got the directions. It was a teen club, and they were kicking somebody out of the club for the unforgivable sin of turning 20 years old. No longer, so they had to have a square of 7 adults to welcome them into the adult world of square dance. And I was the extra guy. Her name was Deborah. Guess who my tour guide was for the next 7 days? And 6 dances, because I was the caller from out of town with the funny accent.
Bob Pointer. I had a dance in Anderson, Indiana one year. The hall was a converted church. Round Dance Cure had bought the old church, turned it into a square dance hall, hired me at a national convention to come and call for his club. I drove all the way from Chicago down to Anderson, Indiana. Get there and I get all set up. Dance supposed to start at 8 o'clock. I took one couple with me. That was the only couple I had at the whole evening. One couple. At the end, when we finally decided nobody else was going to show up, he says, "Oh, by the way, I want to hire you back." And I says, "Really?" And all since, well, he says, "Yeah." He says, "Next year I'll advertise."
Don Beck, Massachusetts. I want to tell one story, but Tim reminded me of bringing the house down. A quick other one. Early in my calling career, and I didn't have a Hilton yet that had springs on its feet, I used to look for the most solid thing in the hall to call on, and I was doing a hiker outing club group and this old lodge, and at one end was this beautiful, huge stone fireplace and this huge stone hearth that looked very solid and I could put my table on. I actually opted to be where the two halls came together so they could hear me in both directions. But halfway through the evening, that hearth fell down to the floor 3 feet below with a big bang. Unfortunately, nobody was on it or anything. But the one that comes to mind, though, is I was calling a festival up in Nova Scotia, and the afternoon had some nice groups and what have you, but the evening was a 20, 30 square group. And I've always marveled at we callers, I think, do more things than any other entertainer at the same time. I mean, we're our own sound people, we're our own advertising people, we're our own equipment haulers. And while we're calling, we have to think of the music and the choreography and the feedback from the group and the difficult. I mean, there's so many things going on at once. There's not room for anything else. Last tip, trying to get everybody excited, end in a big number. And about a quarter of the way through the singing call, this guy that wasn't a square dancer, at least didn't appear to be by dress, and turned out not to be, started walking up the side and across in front of the stage, carrying a briefcase and looking kind of lost. And for some reason, my mind, as well as calling and building the excitement, said, he's got a bomb in that briefcase. And he slowly walks by me, and I'm thinking, oh my God, what am I going to do? I know he's got a bomb in there. And I'm staring at him, and pretty soon the front row and the next 2 rows of dancers are staring at me as to where's this dance going? You know, things aren't quite there. And he boosts himself up on the stage and sits right next to me, lays his briefcase out next to him, and I'm saying, I got to keep this dance going. I don't know what's going on there. Opens his briefcase, pulls out a comic book and starts reading. Pretty soon the security guards came and closed his briefcase and walked him out, and I was able to bring the dance to a final conclusion by the end of that singing call. And people told me that he's the quote-unquote town idiot. He's just a little loose. They send him off to a home for about a month, and he comes back and roams the street for 2. And he'd been trying to get in the hall all day long, and I actually heard somebody, found an open back door and heard somebody crashing behind me through the stage. But it just brings to mind how many things we do have to think about. And telling myself, it must be okay. It must be in control. They don't look worried. And pulled it out of a hat at the end of it. But
Eric, Interlaw, California. This actually happened to be just a couple of months ago. Storm season, and there was a big storm coming in from the Pacific Northwest. and it was blowing in. This was a big one coming in from Alaska, and we heard about the news. We heard it for days. It was going to be a big one. The winds were blowing. I was out doing a dance in the Central Valley, and a nice group. We had 10 squares out there dancing. Well, I do linear cycles, a plus dance, and I like to make sure, one of my pet peeves is linear cycles done correctly. I like to see dancers do linear cycle correctly, not dance like a recycle, sweep a quarter. I do variations of linear cycle where I don't have them do the peel off. I do other things with it. So to get to that place, they have to do linear cycle correctly. So you just can't expect them off the top. You kind of work into that. So I'm doing linear cycle, and kind of cueing them through to make sure they're dancing the call correctly. The wind's blowing outside. That storm is really coming in now. We're only about an hour into the dance. The wind's blowing. I'm calling linear cycle, and I said to them, I'll bet you were wondering why it's important that you do linear cycle correctly. I kind of have a conversation with the floor. At that moment, the power went out, and it went pitch black in the entire room. And all I've got is a laptop up on stage. The hall went silent, dead silent. I've got a laptop, and there was a gasp in the room. And I just said, that's why it's important that you do linear cycle correctly. And about 15 seconds later, the lights came back on, and we continued on with the dance. So.
Bill Eiler from Albuquerque. I often wondered whether my career as a caller in the 80s was jinxed or not, because we have, in Albuquerque, we have a few small towns around us, but we have no suburbs at all. So everything is distant if you go call in the area. So as a newer caller, I was booked to call a dance down in Belen, which is 30 miles south. And so I got there with all what I thought was all my equipment, and I was looking for my power cord. And, of course, you guys have all experienced this. I didn't have my power cord. It was still at my house 30 miles away. So the gods were looking after me, and somehow in the Hilton that I had, an extension cord plugs in the back, so I had power. We figured that out within about 10 minutes. So, I knew I'd learned my lesson. I was going to make sure everything was there. So the next Saturday, I called 30 miles east on the other side of the mountains in Edgewood, New Mexico, at a group, and I was real proud. I had my power cord and my Hilton all together. I forgot my records. So the records weren't there. So that was, I said, well, I'm going to have to be a cappella. And one of the dancers says, oh, no, they do, the kids do square dance here. So I went over and opened up the closet in a little gym cafeteria and pulled out this box of old records. So I had music. So I said, well, I'm safe. I'm favored by the gods. Well, like 2 weeks later, I went to another club, and I had my records, and I had my power cord. I'd forgotten my speaker. I was out of luck that time. There were no speakers, and I had to run all the way home and go get it and then come back. But I thought that after that, I was just totally jinxed.
Mike Oliveri, Denver. Back many years ago, before we had computers, 3-4 years ago, I had a one-night stand, a party dance up in Winter Park, Colorado. And it was during the summer. My wife had a new Buick LeSabre and loaded all the equipment in, speakers, stand, the Hilton, the wireless, the hearing enhancement, and 2 boxes of records, 2 cases of records, the ones from Supreme that held like 150 records each. And we headed off up Berthoud Pass to go to Winter Park. If anybody's been at Berthoud Pass, it's a bunch of switchbacks, the S's, that go all the way up there. And we're driving along in her new car, just having a ball, and we turn this one corner, and the car goes ding, ding, ding. And she's like, wonder what that is. And she looks at the dashboard, and it says the trunk's open. And I turn around, and the trunk's open. And in the middle of the road is one of my record cases. On one of those switchbacks, the record case had shifted, grabbed the little handle that the government now requires that if you're locked inside of your trunk, you can pull that handle to open it, pop that handle. Have you ever heard the sound, like on the radio or TV where somebody takes their foot and squishes a bug and it just... That's what the records sound like when a cement truck runs over them. Out of 150 records, we were able to save 4. Yeah. Try doing a dance with, you've got 4 patter records left, and they've got little pieces of gravel in them. It was an interesting time. Yeah, at least I ducked the semi before, yeah.
There's got to be more war stories. Ron Black.
I do. I'm Ron Black from Los Angeles area. I do a ton of father-daughter Girl Scout dances every year. A couple of months ago, down in Orange County, I ran into a gentleman who came up and said, "I'm here." And I said, "Thank you." He says, "Oh, you don't understand." What? He says, "I've been around the world in 30 days for my corporation." Literally. I got home this morning to tell my daughter that we are not coming to tonight's father-daughter Girl Scout dance. He said, "I already informed my wife to smooth the waters in front of me." And he says, "I was surprised, and I know prompted by my wife." He says, "But when you get a 5-year-old that looks at you with those soulful eyes, because all of her brownie troop is going to the dance." She looked up at him and she says, "Daddy, I know where Mommy keeps the Lorena Bobbitt steak knives." We know this was prompted by Mom, but he says, "Let me tell you, I'm here tonight."
Actually, Roy got a...
I guess it's more Betsy's war stories. I was going to say my worst story is I've been married to a caller for 33 years. But I said I was going to say that. I said I was going to say that.
Yeah, no, we can edit the tapes for the right amount of money.
But I'm sure none of you have ever misjudged the time and were speeding to get to the hall just before the dance starts. But one time that happened to us, and we're driving like and hoping there's no cops in the state of Delaware. So we get to this elementary school, and it's 8:03, and the elementary school is dark. No cars, no lights, no nothing. And at this point, we were saying things like, "Darn," and all of a sudden, this car comes screaming up behind us, and guy jumps out of the car. "You guys got us?" "Yes. We just realized that, we had to move the location, and we told everybody except you." And we said, "Oh, thank God, we've been driving around the school for 20 minutes trying to find a way to get in."
I think at the back there again.
Bob Pointer again. I have one that's not really funny. I don't know if any of you have ever, going home from a dance, come across a body in the middle of the road. We have had that happen, my wife and I. This was back in the 70s. I had a dance I had called in Terre Haute, Indiana, and was going back to our home in Plainfield. And about 40 miles south of Kankakee, Illinois, on US 45, we see a pair of shoes in the middle of the floor of the road. And about 50 yards up the road looks like two bodies, but it was one cut in half. And the irony of it was, you figure, you'll never figure out how it happened or what happened, okay? Well, we had two couples in the car with us who had gone with us. One of the couples in the car, it was their next door neighbor's brother. He and his wife had been celebrating their 25th wedding anniversary. He had been on the wagon for 2 months. His request for their anniversary was to go to the bar he always went to visit with his friends. He got drunk. He went off the wagon, and his wife wanted to take him home, so they got in the car. They got about a mile up from the tavern. He pulled over to the side of the road, took his wallet out, threw it in the car, and said, "That's all you care about? I'm going back to my friends." She took off. He had walked very small distance down the road back to the bar when he heard a car coming. This is all speculation because you can't ask a dead one. But the speculation was that he thought it was her coming back to beg him to go home. And he stepped out in front of a Dodge Charger. And you know how the Dodge Charger's front end is. Caught him right at the waist. Now, would you ever believe that you would find out who was driving that Dodge Charger? I had no idea until the next year that I went back and called the annual dance in Terre Haute, Indiana. One of the dancers come up to me and asked me, did you have anything happen to you on your way home last year? And we said, yes, we did. She said, that was my son driving that car. He was going home from the company that I worked for, Caterpillar, and he was going home for Easter. And that guy, when he stepped out in front of him, well, the young man went into a catatonic stupor, basically. He drove down to the next intersection, pulled his car into the parking lot of a restaurant. He sat down at the table and went into the catatonic stupor. The waitress couldn't get him to respond or anything, so she called the cops. Well, the state police got there. Meanwhile, we're up the road waiting for a state trooper of some type to show up. We're kind of protecting the body. And found out that that's how they found out he was the one driving the car, because his car was there with the imprint of the body on the windshield. And we finally found out all of the detail, but it took about a year before we actually got all the details of it. And I hope y'all never, ever have anything like that happen. The first car to come by was a lady in the car by herself, and we were thankful that we were there to keep her from seeing all of that. The next one coming up was two of his buddies driving a pickup truck, and they were so drunk they couldn't hardly stand up when they got out of the car and looking, and they didn't even recognize him. So I hope it never happens to any of you, because I had nightmares for a long time.
Okay, no more stories like that. Randy, and then we're going to go to John Jones.
Well, I've been calling in Mesa for quite some time, and one of the halls that I have has got about a 4-foot stage on it. And one of the ladies, it was a single lady, she was really dressed up that night with the long high heels and again, wearing a wig. And the floors evidently was a little slippery for her shoes, because she went down straight like a bullet, just hit the floor. And her wig came shooting up into the air and was eye to eye with me, and I'm on a 4-foot stage. Without missing a beat, she sprung up, grabbed the wig, and finished weave the ring. The other one was the same square location right in front of me. My good old friend Vern, he lost his teeth. They went kind of squirting across the floor, and I couldn't hardly believe it. He finishes weaving the ring and picked them up on the other side and put them back in. When they got home, I couldn't hardly finish the tip. I was laughing so hard, and for some reason I carry a set of uppers in my record case. And I took them and I said, do you need the uppers to those bottoms? And then the whole floor knew what was going on, but it was just hilarious.
Many years ago, we had a week-long institute with Les Goetcher, and a guy with a reel-to-reel tape recorder taped everything that he was doing. And one evening during the dance, he had a foot pedal on his tape recorder, and he clicked that foot pedal, and Goetcher was calling out the speakers, but it wasn't him. We were not dancing what he was calling. And he couldn't figure out for quite some time why his voice was coming through the speakers with different calls from what he was trying to call. And he looked around once to change his record, and we left the floor. That's happened to me several times before. Von Parrish was a great, large man, and he smoked cigarettes for a long time. And he used to slap his leg when he called, and he carried wooden matches in that pocket, and he lit them one night and set his pants on fire while he was calling. Full-time caller Jim Brower, many years ago, showed up in McCracken, Kansas to call a dance a year early. One of the worst equipment nights that I ever had was in a building in North Texas when during the winter and the temperature was minus 20 degrees, and they were dancing in an old wooden school building, and the toilets were frozen, and I wore a top coat and gloves, and I had a 56-watt Newcomb, and it never did warm up enough to turn the turntable all the time, so I spun the turntable with my finger the entire night. The whole dance, I did that. And I told that story to Tony, and he said, I thought the worst night you had calling a square dance with equipment was when he and Vernon and I were doing a weekend, and he walked by a Hilton speaker that was on the stage and hung his foot in the stand, turned it over, and the corner of it hit me right here in the back of the head and knocked me out. And I haven't gotten even yet. But neither have I forgotten it. Remember the song, Good Morning Country Rain? I was calling a dance one evening in an open pavilion with about 30 squares. And I did the first tip, and just as I got into the singing call and started singing the chorus line of Good Morning Country Rain, extremely strong storm blew in with the wind blowing horizontal and rain blowing all the way across this pavilion, blew the record off the turntable and across, and that was the end of the dance, and I never called that song again.
Aaron at the back, and then Ray.
I have a couple, but I'll leave Scott to tell one of them. This is something that we just did a couple of years ago. Some of you have heard about our famous Adobe Squares in Petaluma, and they have a huge anniversary dance every year, which usually averages between 35, around 35 squares. And they always have the ghostwriters. And this particular year, they had 3 callers. And we waited till about the last tip, and Scott had recently gotten a hearing enhancement system, and we have 6 receivers, and our friend Lawrence has another system with a couple. So they went over to the side and they set up both hearing enhancements and a little amp, and we handpicked a square of teenagers, and they went out and squared up right in front of the callers. But they literally were not dancing to the callers on the stage. They were dancing to Scott, who was calling over on the side. And every once in a while, one of them would run off and someone else would get the equipment on, and they would run out and join the square. And the same thing. And Scott was very, very careful to make sure that he called things that were totally different than what the 3 guys on the stage were calling. And it took them pretty much the entire tip to figure out how it was being done. Because they kept looking to see if anyone in the square was talking. And, of course, nobody was even, moving their mouth. So that was amazing.
I better stand up and do this. Happened several years ago when we were doing week-long things in Colorado at Fun Week, we called it. At the end of the dance, we'd just have a little after party, and I decided this night that I would divide the group into 3 parts and do this little song. Oh, there was an old man, and he had an old style, had an old style. That one. This group over here had a leader, and I pointed a leader from front of them. They go, this group right here in the middle, point a leader for them, and over here, whistle. So Bronk Wise was there with me, and Zuzi Dean, and while we were rehearsing this, they started laughing. And they're back over there, and I said, get the hell out of here. We're trying to do a song. Get out of here. Get them out. I ran them outside. So we started the song and go along, and everybody starts laughing. I didn't know what the hell's going on. So I finally got through. We got through the song. I finally said, what in the heck is going on out here? Well, every time that guy in the middle there, he's texting, every time he go, his teeth would come out. And he'd grab them and put them back in.
You hand the microphone to Ray right there. Ray had his hand up. Didn't you, Ray? Yeah.
Oh, this story is about when my wife, Lottie, first started calling. Well, the first thing she wanted to do is go to a good caller school. So we learned about a school that was not too far from us, Lone Star College that John Jones and Jerry and Tony Oxendine were doing at the time. And I remember she made a phone call to John to begin the enrollment process.
And she asked him a few questions, and of course learned that the other parties in the caller school were Jerry Story and Tony Oxendine. So she made a comment to me, "Oh, those are my favorite callers. I'm going to need to come to that." And he says, "Well, what about me?" She says, "Oh, I never heard of you."
Don Beck, Massachusetts. I was calling up in Maine once, and I was just about set up to go, and the club president came up, "Is there anything else you need? Is there anything else we can do?" And I thought, yeah, on the last tip, and I can signal you when that is if there's a question, but just going up towards 11 o'clock, I'm going to use dim the lights and pour the wine and just sort of slow things down and let them go home. And if you could get the custodian to slowly dim the lights while I'm doing that, that'd add some atmosphere to it. And I said, we'll see what we can do. Called the dance. It was in a huge gymnasium. Unfortunately, it wasn't totally hugely full, but it had enough squares there to make a good dance. And last singing call, as I start calling this, I guess I hadn't been smart enough to look. The gym had big banks of fluorescent lighting. So when the custodian was turning the lights off, there'd be a bunch go off here and a bunch go off here. There was no dimming them. They were just being turned off in pieces here and there. And I said, oh, well, you try. Right after that, a lot of the dancers come up and line up to thank me and walk through in the receiving or unreceiving line. And some guy stopped and he says, I got to apologize. And I said, for what? And he said, I'm the vice president, and with the prices we're paying this janitor, you'd think he'd wait till the dance is over before he starts turning the lights on.
Scott Byers, Sacramento, California. We actually used to live down in Riverside area, which is just a little bit east of here. And we used to come down and do dances quite frequently. And there's this one club that was called the Silver Dollars out here. And I was calling, I think they were on a Wednesday night, but I was out calling and having a great time. I was doing all kinds of things. And then during the break, I walked down and shook everybody's hand, said, hi, how are you doing? How's life? How are you doing? How's the kid? And I come to this beautifully dressed woman. I mean, absolutely gorgeous. Her hair was perfect. Her dress was perfect. I shook her hand and I said, how are you doing? And she says, I hate your music. And I said, well, I can't please everybody. I understand that. She says, it's not square dance music. And I said, well, yeah, it's, I use a lot of 4/4 time signature. I don't use a lot of 2/4, boom chukka. And she says, no, I mean square dance music. And I said, oh, okay. So I walked away and I went to the president of the club and I said, who is that lady? And, well, I can't say names, can I? Oh, okay. So he said, well, that's the mother of a very well-known CALLERLAB Board of Governors. Shh, quiet. And I said, oh, okay, well, he had comped me one of his singing calls, so I'm going to do the singing call and impress this lady. So I get up there and I start talking about him and how great he is and a wonderful caller and good friend, and he comped me this record, and I'm going to put the record on, and she gets up there with her husband and she gets out there ready to dance, and she's out there dancing. I put the record on, I do it, and she leaves the floor. It was the only record he had ever recorded that she hated. Now, that's not the end of the story. I had met this board of directors, fabulous caller from CALLERLAB, at a nationals, one of the pre-con dances, and I was there, and we were talking, and I said, I ran into your mother, and this is what she did to me. And he says, oh yeah, she does that to me all the time.
Roy Gata.
More of a dancer story that it's not really a war story, a little funny thing, but Betsy was calling a dance. Guest spot, had never been to this club. Calls the first tip. Guy in the some of you have told this story too. Guy in the first square, absolutely clueless, not like he'd never been to a square dance before, and people are going, God, what is wrong? This guy's a really good dancer. Second tip, same thing, same guy, just absolutely clueless. And now the members of the club are literally worried about him, thinking maybe like something's wrong, like something's happening that maybe we should be concerned about. All of a sudden, his wife leans over and says something to him. He didn't make a mistake the rest of the evening. He was now Betsy, of course, saw all this, and she's going, "What the?" She finally, near the end, she had to ask this woman, "What did you say to him?" And now realized. So, and the woman said, "Well, I reminded him that at home he's got me, 4 daughters, my mother-in-law. He'd never danced to a female caller before. He realized he had to listen." True story.
We'll go to, we'll get Rod and then Randy.
Rod Shipping from California. I was calling a little festival in Nevada, and we'd done a workshop all day Saturday and everything, but the club says we want to do a grand entrance. So we're going to, before the 8 o'clock start of the evening program, we're going to walk you in from the back of the hall and, parade you down through there. So I said, okay, fine, no problem. We came in the door, and I caught my heel of my boot on the threshold and ripped it off. So I got to hobble, one-footed, all the way through the entire group of square dancers. And nobody said a word. But during the break, they took my shoe out and repaired it.
Where are you, Randy?
Right at the back.
Way in the back.
While you're on your way back there, not too long ago at a dance at my own club, I have 3 squares of challenge people dancing in the front square. I have a whole bunch of Bobs in the group and a whole bunch of Peters in the group. And this particular square had 4 Peters in the group. And I said to them, "Hey, look at you. You guys got 4 Peters." And the other square said, "Us too."
You better push the button on that one. This is a true story that was in Houston when the National was in Houston, and the sound people were hired and did not know anything about square dancing. The acoustics was terrible. We couldn't put our own record on, and this one black gentleman was running the PA, and Tony was up first, and the guy, his hand was shaking so bad that I'm sure he ruined the beginning of that record. But anyway, Tony's calling along, and the record ends, and it's a patter record. And Tony's trying to get him to set it back, and he doesn't. So Tony just continues without the music, finishes. Jerry comes up next, and they got the guy kind of calmed down. They started joshing around with him and calling him Wichita, and anyway, he got the needle on again, and Jerry explained to the guy that when you get about 1/8 of an inch from the end of the record, set it back. So he did that. I come up next. I'm getting ready to do a singing call. He sets it back. I figured, okay, well, I'll pick it up. He didn't set it all the way to the beginning, so I continue. I'm getting extra time. He sets it back a second time. I just walked off.
This is relevant, Ron Black. Same convention, same sound system, right? Right. And one of the guys bought 4 of the amplifiers. He said greatest amplifiers he'd ever seen, took them back to Sacramento and made boat anchors out of them. That's how bad those were.
Yes, Ron Nelson from San Diego. Years ago when I first moved to San Diego, I was asked to do a guest, actually it was a substitution for a caller that was out traveling away. And I was forewarned that this club didn't do any DVD. You had to strictly be standard application because I would lose the floor. So I got to the hall, and the president tells me that on the third tip they had an A1 tip, and he says we've been workshopping A1, and we got this list of about 12 calls. He gives me the list of what they can do. He says if you call any of these, they can do it. So I got up and squared up, and I said heads, square chain through, and they all turned around and looked up at me and said, Ken, don't do it that way. The same dance, as the evening progressed, there was these two big fans in the back of the room. I mean, with blades 6 feet tall, and they were blowing. And so the back of the hall, the sound was pretty impossible. And so as we're finishing up, and I'm putting the equipment away, they're bringing me my pay to pay me for the dance. And I said, gee, I wish we didn't have those blowers back there blowing like that. He said, well, Ken always turns those off.
Since I don't see other hands up, I'm going to hog the mic again. Don Beck. For many, many years now, I've been trying to keep women's lib policies in my mind, and I frequently have the women do-si-do instead of the girls, and the men run instead of the boys. And it's caused some interesting problems. Once, many years ago, calling in Prague, I called men run and nobody moved. And then I heard a whisper of somebody saying boys run, and it spread through the floor, and they all learned that men and boys meant the same thing, and they could dance after that. Standard language problems kind of thing. I also, when I would do something thinking about this, I'd call, weave the ring, swing that person, and promenade, because the women are swinging the men are swinging the women, the girls are swinging the boys. But I just swing that person so it was either sex counted. After a tip that I'd done that in a singing call and what have you, I was walking down the side, shaking hands with people and just greeting them and saying, how you doing? And some woman said, with a frown on her face, I've got a complaint. And I said, okay, fire, what is it? She said, I'm a girl. I'm a lady. I'm a woman, but I'm not a person. Okay, you can't win for losing. And the last one in that series, another dance I was calling, and I think it was, I can't remember, it was probably in the singing call. And I said, and the four little ladies chain across, just using the normal rhythm. And I realized that little ladies, that's going to offend somebody. And so I squoze in the words, and you big ones go too. And I knew that was a whoops. They were lined up at the stage after the tip.
Ned, are you able to tell yours on the mic? Okay, hang on.
Ned Newberg, Las Vegas, Nevada. Many years ago, while I was in Germany, we were doing we went up to a dance at Hahn Air Force Base, and I was with the Air Force then. And the clubs sometimes got buses from the military to drive to and from the dances. We were lucky in that. Those were the good days. And it was a January dance, so we were going up to Hahn Air Force Base to dance with the group up there. And on our way back, before we got there, the gentleman, we had trouble with bus drivers, so the Air Force came up with a bus driver for us, an airman first. But he didn't check how much diesel was on the bus. So we got up there, and we do the dance, we go to the after party. It's about 11 o'clock when he realizes we don't have enough diesel to get back to the base, back to Kaiserslautern. So we go back to Hahn Air Force Base, and we try to get on base. Well, they don't know anything about us being there. We finally get on base and get down to the fuel yard, which is like 100 yards from the flight line. This is in the 1980s. We have Germans on the bus. Well, they're not too keen with civilians near Air Force bases. So, and at the time, the still Red Army was still around at that time, so they were kind of paranoid about it. So, we're on the flight line for about an hour. The bus is turned off, and it's cold. It's January. It's in Han, which is higher up in elevation, so we're in the mountains. And it's cold. Well, the bus keeps getting colder and colder. We got 2 squares of people, went out onto the concrete and danced. We had gas, and the bus filled within 20 minutes of us stepping onto the flight line.
Virgil Forbes, I'll help Don a little. Ron told a story a little bit about a Girl Scout father-daughter banquet. Boy, I wish they were all that easy. Some of my club members, she was an executive with the Baltimore Girl Scout Association, whatever they call it. And she called me one day and said, we're going to have a dance down at Maryland Historical Society. Would you like to come do some first nighter stuff? Gene Harrell, Stan and Gene were also presidents of the Square Dance Federation. Any caller who is asked by the presidents of the Federation to come do them a favor, probably not a bad idea. Yeah? So I said, okay, Maryland Historical Society, Saturday, 2 o'clock. Get down there, find out. There are 240 some odd brownies, 6, 7, and 8. All girls. The only man in the hall was Stan Harrell, Gene's husband. Well, you all know it's kind of limited what you can do with 6 and 7-year-olds anyway. Birdie dance, Macarena, okay, but Gene came up and said, I want you to do something square dancing. So I pull out, make haste to the wedding. I'm going to do Virginia Reel. So we're, up and back. Leave out the reel part, up, do-si-do, right arm turn, left arm turn. Everybody march, go down, make an arch. Well, Stan is leading one of the, is tail into one of the lines, helping the girls. So he does the march and helps them lead. They make an arch, and they want him to go under. Stan Harrell is 6'8". They refused to break the arch. They wanted him to go under. He had to get down on his hands and knees and practically his belly to get under that arch.
We'll go to Roy, and then we'll get Aaron and Mike Jacobs, and we'll probably be out of time.
Caller school story. Some of you in the room, I'm sure, remember Dick Jones. And his wife, Artie. Artie was also a very good voice and speech counselor, and they were running a local caller school, and there was a young teenager, I won't use names, and he was actually one of Dick's proteges, and Artie had a real problem with the term bust out to a line. Just felt it had the wrong connotations. Your Bob story reminded me of it. And so it was this young fellow's turn to call, and he's sweating bullets trying, because Artie said it's break out to a line. So I think you can see where this is going. And the young guy's trying like crazy not to say bust out to a line. And, of course, what came out was breast out to a line. And basically, Artie, God bless her, was speechless. Dick is trying very hard not to laugh his head off, but that was just funny.
Yeah, the way to handle that one with the tall guy, one of our kids just picked the little girl up and lifted him over her head and handed her to his dad. But that's not actually my story, and I have a video of that, by the way. One time, Scott had gotten very upset in the afternoon. He was very, very angry. And when that happens, later on, he's doing this dance, and all this energy that he had built up from the anger, he just channeled into the enthusiasm of the dance. And he had these people so high and so excited that he could do no wrong. Anything he did, to the point that the dance was supposed to end at 10:45, and at 11:15 they're still on the floor. Okay? We can't get them to go home. So he's thinking of new weird things to do, and he starts calling initials. It's like BR as boys run and PT is pass through. And he's throwing these initials out, and they're just dancing. And I was on the floor with them. And he gets them into a quarter tag, and he says, PP circulate. And they do it. Oh, trust me, we're not there yet. And he calls it again, PP circulate, and they all do it. And here it comes. Extend your PP. The amazing thing was they were so up and so excited, nobody caught it but me. And I'm out there looking at these people. They're just dancing away so smiley, and I'm like, you know, it's just...
Mike Jacobs, Hamilton, New Jersey. We've all seen at different festivals or large dances, one time or another, that you're calling along, somebody accidentally shoots out of their square into the next square. Instead of turning the corner in the circulate, they went straight ahead. Everybody's seen that. But of course, the usual result right away is the square that got the new dancer breaks down, and the square that loses a dancer breaks down because it couldn't complete the move. However, I was calling C3, and their phantoms are usually the run-of-the-mill road. So I called, and as I was calling the sequence, I watched this dancer shoot out of the square she was in into the next square. Well, when you got 8 phantoms, what's one less person, you know? And at the same time, when you have 8 phantoms and one person fills in the spot, how do you notice? So the sequence went on, and the square that's got the extra person has this one lady that keeps bouncing off a spot she thinks she's supposed to go to. And the other square, they still haven't noticed anything yet, that they're missing one person. And so I finally had to go to the end of the sequence for both squares to notice that they were missing or gained a dancer.
Well, we got time for a couple more if anybody has any more. Oh, Mr. Ed Foote. And we might, and that might be a problem.
This occurred in 1995. We were doing a European tour, and we started off calling Berlin for a weekend, and the leader there set me up with other dances. We went to Nuremberg and Munich and then on to Austria. Came back to Prague, and he had set up a weekend for me in Prague, and there were about 12 squares. And this was in 1995, so it was only about 5 years after it was still Czechoslovakia. The Czechoslovakia had dropped communism. So square dancing was only like 5 years old. The people in Prague were extremely poor. No money whatsoever. They supplied me with a turntable that was homemade, and when I put the 45 record on it, you couldn't see the turntable. That's how small it was. And so naturally they couldn't afford square dance clothes. So the men just wore regular shirts, and all the girls wore skirts and everything, but nobody had any square dance clothes. Now these people, about 12 squares, there were maybe 3 squares of mature adults, 50s and 60s. Everybody else was unbelievably young. Late teens, very early 20s. And if you can picture the wildest youth group you have ever seen dance, that's the way they danced all the calls, leaping around. It was high energy. So I start off calling Friday night. And lo and behold, the leader of the group in Berlin who had set up my whole tour walks in. Now, Berlin is 400 miles from Prague. So I said, what are you doing here? You just danced to me a whole weekend, and I'm going to have to call real easy here. Why? And he's by himself. He wasn't married. I said, why are you here in Prague? He said, because in Prague, the girls don't wear petticoats.
Let's go to Bob Pointer for our final story.
Now, this is a good one. Bob Pointer, Florida. I used to do a weekend with Cal Golden when Cal was sharing it with all the local boys. Chuck Marlowe from Ohio, myself, and Cal. Chuck had been teaching a group, and he brought 3 squares to the weekend, and he had been teaching them peel off. Okay? They all came prepared to get Cal Golden. So he had it all set up that the first night, his 3 squares would get right up front where Cal couldn't see them because the stage was real high. The first set of squares you couldn't see but just their heads. The 3 of us are opening the evening. Cal is calling. Chuck keeps whispering in his ear, call peel off. Call peel off. They've been working on it real hard. So finally, Cal calls peel off. Clothes start flying everywhere. Cal is stopped cold. Well, being Cal Golden, he was not going to be topped. Cal gets me in the after party, and he said, Bob, we're going to get Chuck. He says, you know his favorite call? I said, yeah, boys run. He said, yeah, we're going to get him tomorrow night, Saturday night, main event. Chuck's up there calling, and the first time he calls boys run, every man in that hall ran out the hall. Chuck just dropped the mic.
Hey, thank you all for sharing your stories with us. A nice hand for Mike on the mic.
Thank you. Remember, if you like it, put it on the critique sheet. Big hand for Tim for being the moderator.
Thank you all for sharing your stories. Have a great convention.